Right now, there are 3 American families who got a knock on the door this weekend that no American family ever wants to get. 3 soldiers killed, 5 more seriously wounded, and the war is 4 days old. Here is something that should be burning in your mind. Before Operation Epic Fury launched on February 28th, a Washington Post poll found that only 27% of Americans supported military strikes on Iran. 27%. That means when Donald Trump ordered the bombs to fall on Tehran, when American pilots flew those missions, when American taxpayers funded every missile, nearly 3 out of 4 Americans either opposed the action or were not sure it was the right thing to do. And yet here we are. The bombs fell anyway. The soldiers died anyway. And now, almost nobody in the room where this decision was made can tell you clearly what winning looks like, what the exit plan is, or how this ends. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth went on television and said, and I want you to hear this carefully, this is not Iraq, and it will not be endless. And Donald Trump, at almost the exact same moment, posted on Truth Social, asking why there wouldn't be regime change in Iran. 2 members of the same administration, saying 2 opposite things about the same war, in the same news cycle. That is not a communication problem. That is a psychology problem. And it is the psychology problem we are going to decode today. Because what is happening right now, the reason this war may be impossible to end, the reason 3/4 of Americans who oppose it still have no meaningful say over whether it continues, the reason Pete Hegseth has to say it's not Iraq while the president posts. The MIGA is not primarily a political or military story. It is a story about the human mind under pressure, about how wars start in psychology long before they start in strategy, about the specific psychological architecture that makes certain conflicts nearly impossible to stop once they begin, and about what history, very specifically, American history, tells us happens next when those psychological forces are in motion. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to see this war differently. Not through a Republican lens or a Democratic lens, through a psychological one. Before we go further, this channel exists to decode what no headline will tell you. We don't do partisan takes. We do psychology. If that matters to you, subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because this story is going to develop fast, and we will be here every step of the way with the analysis that actually explains what you're watching. Now, let's go inside the trap. To understand why this war may be impossible to end, you first need to understand a concept in political psychology called an open-ended commitment trap, and specifically why the United States of America has fallen into it with a regularity that has defined the last quarter century of its foreign policy. An open-ended commitment trap is precisely what it sounds like. A military engagement that begins with a specific stated objective: destroy nuclear facilities, eliminate a threat, but that immediately generates a set of new competing objectives. The moment it begins, each of which requires continued engagement to address. The original mission cannot be completed without creating conditions that demand a next mission, and the next mission cannot be completed without creating conditions that demand the one after that. In August 2002, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz said the Iraq mission would cost between $50 and $100 billion and last a matter of months. Over 4,400 American soldiers died, trillions of dollars were spent, and American forces did not fully leave Iraq until 2011, 9 years later. In Afghanistan, the initial mission was to dismantle al-Qaeda's operational infrastructure. 20 years and 2,400 American lives later, the Taliban controlled more territory when the U.S. left than when it arrived. These are not stories of military incompetence. They are stories of the open-ended commitment trap in action. And the trap works through a specific psychological mechanism that researchers in decision science call escalation of commitment, the documented human tendency to increase investment in a chosen course of action in direct proportion to the evidence that it is failing because the psychological cost of admitting failure exceeds the psychological cost of continuing. Al Jazeera's analyst Ibrahim Abu Ershad has drawn a direct parallel between the rhetoric used to justify Iraq in 2003 and the rhetoric used to justify Iran in 2026. The same language of rogue regimes, the same claims of weapons of mass destruction, the same moral urgency, the same bypassing of UN resolutions and congressional oversight. The Trump administration did not consult allies. As Abu Ershad notes, unlike 2003, only Israel is fully on board. The UK refused to allow US aircraft to use its bases, forcing B-2 bombers to fly 18-hour missions directly from the continental United States. That level of diplomatic isolation is historically unprecedented for a major American military operation, and it has a specific psychological consequence. It removes the external pressure points that have, in previous conflicts, provided off-ramps. When you are operating alone, there is no coalition partner to say stop. There is no UN resolution to respect. There is no shared framework within which de-escalation can be negotiated with international legitimacy. The trap is sealed tighter, and now the mission itself is internally contradicted. The stated goal, according to Vice President Vance and Secretary Hegseth, is not regime change. But the president's own words and the operational reality of assassinating a supreme leader, destroying military infrastructure, and calling on the Iranian population to rise up, all point toward regime change as the only logical endpoint. When a mission's publicly stated objective and its operational logic point in opposite directions, the people executing the mission have no clear definition of success. And when there is no clear definition of success, there is no clear definition of when to stop. That is the first layer of the trap. The war began without an agreed ending. And in the psychology of conflict, a war without a defined ending does not end. It escalates. There is a question that almost nobody in the American media is asking right now, and it is the most psychologically important question of this entire crisis. Not why did Trump start this war, but why couldn't he stop himself from starting it, even when his own base was war-weary, even when 3/4 of the public opposed it, even when diplomacy was producing real results, even when his own advisors were reportedly divided. To answer that question, you need to understand a specific psychological dynamic that researchers call the credibility trap, and it operates through a mechanism that is as old as human social psychology, the public commitment problem. Donald Trump's political identity, the story he tells about himself, and the story his supporters tell about him, is built almost entirely on a single premise. He does the things that other politicians were too weak to do. He calls out what others won't name. He takes the action that others were too afraid to take. This is not just messaging. It is the core of his psychological brand, and it has been reinforced by millions of people across 8 years of political life. For years, long before he took office, Trump said Iran was the #1 state sponsor of terror. Iran would not get a nuclear weapon on his watch. America under Obama and Biden had been humiliated by Iran. The message was repeated so often, in so many speeches, on so many platforms, that it became the kind of public commitment that in social psychology is nearly impossible to walk back without catastrophic identity cost. Psychologists who study political behavior call this belief perseverance under public commitment. Once a leader has stated a position publicly and repeatedly, contradicting it requires not just intellectual flexibility, but a form of psychological self-destruction. And for Trump, the specific trigger was the February 27th IAEA report confirming that Iran had concealed highly enriched uranium from previous inspectors. Trita Parsi, executive vice president of the Quincy Institute, told Al Jazeera that Trump's shifting justifications for the war, first Iranian protests, then nuclear threat, then liberation of the Iranian people, then civilization itself, are evidence of what Parsi called desperation. He is, in Parsi's words, desperately trying to come up with a justification that will be convincing to his base for a war that only 1 in 5 Americans sees as justified. That is a devastating psychological read, and it is almost certainly accurate. The multiplying justifications are not dishonesty in the conventional sense. They are a mind searching for the frame that will make a decision that was made for psychological reasons feel like a decision that was made for strategic ones. But here is where the credibility trap becomes specifically dangerous for the United States. Because the war that was started partly to restore credibility now has to be won to maintain it. A messy outcome, a prolonged stalemate, a withdrawal that looks anything like Kabul or Iran that survives in any form that can claim victory. All of these outcomes would cost Trump more credibility than not starting the war would have. Which means the psychological logic of the credibility trap drives not toward de-escalation, but toward doubling down. And doubling down in a conflict with an adversary that has asymmetric capabilities spread across a region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq, proxies in Syria, does not lead to quick resolution. It leads to the long war that Hegseth said this was not going to be. Already, Iranian retaliation has killed 4 American service members. Kuwait accidentally shot down 3 American jets during Iranian counterstrikes, and all crew had to eject. The regional spillover is happening in real time, in the first week of the war, exactly as the psychological architecture of the open-ended commitment trap predicts it would. There is a statistic that I want you to sit with for a moment, because it is one of the most politically significant numbers in recent American history, and almost no mainstream coverage is properly contextualizing it. According to a CNN poll conducted March 2nd, just 4 days into this war, 59% of Americans disapprove of the U.S. decision to take military action in Iran, and a majority say a long-term military conflict is likely. A Reuters Ipsos poll from the same window found 43% disapprove, only 27% approve, and nearly a third are unsure. A Washington Post flash poll found more Americans oppose the strikes than support them, and a clear majority say the Trump administration has not clearly explained its goals. These numbers are not just politically significant. They are psychologically, historically significant because they represent a public posture toward an American military operation that is almost unprecedented. At the outset of a conflict, the Iraq War launched in 2003 with approximately 72% public support. Afghanistan in 2001 launched with approximately 88% public support. The Iran strikes launched with, depending on the poll, somewhere between 25% and 34% support. America has never started a major war this unpopular, this fast, and that disconnect between what the government did and what the public wanted is itself a psychological phenomenon with a specific name: democratic deficit stress. It is the cognitive and emotional pressure that builds in a democratic society when the gap between public will and government action becomes visible and undeniable. And democratic deficit stress, historically, does not produce passive acceptance. It produces organized opposition, the kind that ends presidencies, flips midterm elections, and defines the political landscape for a generation. The Washington Post's analysis from March 1st notes that Trump's Iran war risks alienating war-weary supporters, specifically the MAGA voters who chose him at least partly because he promised an America-first, non-interventionist foreign policy. These are voters who remember the Iraq disaster, who heard for years that Washington elites kept sending American kids to die in foreign wars for reasons that never quite added up, who believed Trump when he implicitly and sometimes explicitly positioned himself as the candidate who would end that pattern. And now, in the second month of his second term, He has started the most significant American military operation since Iraq. Foreign Policy published a piece with a title that should be uncomfortable for everyone across the political spectrum. Trump's Iran war shows the United States is still addicted to military conflict. That framing, addiction, is psychologically precise. Addiction is what happens when a behavior produces short-term relief or reward, generates longer-term damage, creates dependency that makes stopping harder than continuing, and persists despite the knowledge of those long-term consequences. American military intervention in the Middle East, viewed through that psychological lens, fits the clinical profile with uncomfortable accuracy. Every administration promises this time will be different. Every conflict begins with a clear objective that generates new objectives. Every exit plan turns out to be the beginning of the next chapter. And now, as Democrats prepare a war powers resolution, as even some Republicans quietly express reservations about the strategic logic, as the midterm election shadow grows longer over every decision being made in the Situation Room, the American public is watching in real time as the pattern they thought they'd escaped repeats itself once again. So we come to the question that every American, regardless of politics, regardless of party, needs to sit with. Not what do you think about Donald Trump? Not what do you think about Iran? But this, is there a way out? Is there, in the psychology of how this conflict was started, a psychological pathway toward ending it that does not lead through the same catastrophic patterns that defined Iraq and Afghanistan? And the honest answer, the psychologically rigorous, historically grounded answer, is, but only if the people making the decisions can do something that the psychology of the situation is actively working against them doing. They have to be willing to define a ceiling. To say publicly and precisely, this is what success looks like. This is where the military operation ends, and we will hold to that definition, even when the logic of escalation tells us to go further. The problem is that the current administration has made two mutually contradictory public statements about the mission's scope. Vance and Hegseth say not regime change. Trump says MIGA, and the operational reality on the ground points toward regime change as the only logical endpoint of what has been started. Without a unified, publicly committed definition of success, the open-ended commitment trap has no mechanism for closure. The soldiers who died this weekend did not die for a clearly defined objective that can be achieved and then ended. They died in the opening chapter of a conflict whose ending no one in a position of power has yet been willing to write. And the 40 days that follow, the Iranian regime's declared mourning period that is simultaneously a succession window, a consolidation exercise, as in a psychological buffer, are 40 days in which the question of what comes after in Iran remains entirely unanswered by anyone in Washington. The Washington Post's national security reporting from March 2nd makes this starkly plain. Trump pursued a decapitation strategy without a plan for what comes next. The United States has a fraught track record of toppling autocratic regimes and securing peaceful democracies, even when it has a vision for the day after. Right now, there is no public vision for the day after. There is no coalition to share the burden of reconstruction. There is no regional consensus on what a post-Islamic Republic Iran should look like. There is no agreed framework for preventing a power vacuum from being filled by something worse than what it replaced, which is precisely what happened in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan. The psychological forces that started this war, Trump's credibility trap, Netanyahu's 3-decade identity obsession, the collective intentionality of advisors and allies who all wanted the same outcome for different reasons. Those forces do not automatically generate a coherent post-conflict strategy. They generated a strike plan, but a strike plan and an endgame are not the same thing. And history, American history specifically, is a long and costly education in what happens when they are confused for one another. 3 American families got a knock on the door this weekend. The war is 4 days old. The mourning period in Iran has 40 days to run. And when those 40 days end, when the succession window closes, when the streets of Tehran fill again with people who have been waiting and watching and calculating, the question of what this war was actually for, and whether it can actually end, will no longer be abstract. It will be the only question that matters. And the answer, for the soldiers who will be sent for the Americans, who will pay for it for the world that will live inside its consequences, had better be something more than the silence that greets it right now. I want to leave you with something that cuts through the partisan noise, something that is true regardless of whether you voted for Trump or against him, whether you believe Iran was a threat or a manufactured crisis, whether you think the strikes were necessary or reckless. 3 Americans are dead. 27% of the country supported the action that sent them. And the administration that ordered it cannot agree on what success looks like. That combination, that specific configuration of public opposition, internal contradiction, and undefined endgame has a historical signature. It is the signature of the wars that defined a generation, and from which the United States is still decades later paying costs in money and lives and moral authority that it did not budget for and cannot fully account for. This is quiet power. We do not tell you what to think about the politics. We tell you what the psychology reveals about what is actually happening beneath the politics. The forces, the patterns, the mechanisms that determine outcomes, regardless of which party is in power or which flag is flying over the decision. Subscribe if you want to stay inside that analysis, because this story is not over. In 40 days, when Iran's mourning period ends and the succession window closes and the streets fill again, we will be here with the psychological framework to understand what happens next before it gets translated into partisan talking points by people with an interest in your outrage rather than your understanding. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know one thing. Do you think there is a real exit strategy for this war? Or do you think we are watching the opening chapter of something that will outlast this administration? I read every comment. Until the next one, think clearly, see deeply, and remember, the most consequential forces in politics are always the ones operating beneath the surface of what you are being shown.